Ladies and gentlemen, did you know that Czerny, the famous student of Beethoven, left more than 1,000 opus numbers? This man composed so incredibly fast that he used 7 desks simultaneously in his music room, going from one desk to the other, basically going from one composition to the other, because he had no time to waste until the ink was dry. So a servant followed him, waited for the ink to dry and then turned the page, so that when he returned he could continue working on the composition he left on desk 1. It's almost like a brilliant chess player, isn't it? And did you know he didn't compose only etudes? The piece that's playing in the background of this introduction is a prelude and fugue composed by Czerny. I recorded this a few years ago. Here's a small fragment. And that little girl, by the way, is now in her first year of university studying psychology. Time flies, so no time to lose. Let's dive into the content of this video right away. We're gonna have a look at the Sonata Opus 268, played by a great pianist and great advocate, I have to say, of Czerny's music, Martin Jones. And as always, the goal of these videos is not to point fingers, to say who's right or doing something wrong. The goal of this series is to learn something about the tempi that these authors, these composers of that time prescribe, because these tempi oftentimes are problematic, even so much that they are flat out impossible to play. And so we are trying to find out in this series if people in that time, composers in that time, musicians in that time, used the metronome as we do today, or used a different system, something we call here the WBMP, the whole beat metronome practice, in which every 2 ticks define the note value of the Metronome Marks, much as physicists still do today.
3, 4, 5, 6.
So welcome to another tempo reality check. So why are we doing this exercise? Why is tempo important? I've explained this many times, but for the sake of this video, since we're talking about Czerny, it makes sense to read what this man had to say to us about the importance of tempo, and I quote, "Any musical piece produces its proper effect only when it is played in the exact degree of movement prescribed by its author, and any even inconsiderable deviation from that time, whether as to quickness or slowness, will often totally destroy the sense, the beauty and the intelligibility of the piece." End of quote. Well, those are not my words, those are the words of Czerny. And we all know that. Every musician knows that. Every musician has his feeling, his sense of tempo. That's why debating tempo, that's why talking about tempo, that's why actually suggesting, and more than suggesting I would say we do on this channel, that in those days, the days of Beethoven, Chopin, Schumann and even later, they might have used the metronome in a different way, leading to much slower tempi that we actually think they actually applied. That's why all of that leads to such hot debates, because tempo is very personal. It's connected to all the parameters of a piece, and when you change that tempo, in the words of Czerny, even slightly, you destroy the intention of the composer. Big words. I don't personally think that Czerny wrote that you can play a piece only in one way, with one exact tempo, but what he wrote is this: when you change the tempo prescribed by the composer, you change, in his word, destroy, but you change the original intention of the composer by a lot, even when you change that tempo only slightly. All composers of that time actually agreed on that, the importance of the correct tempo. Therefore this series is important, and therefore I would say looking into the works of Czerny is extremely important. So let's go. So 4 movements to discuss. Let's start obviously with the first movement. Here's a short fragment. We have 225 bars here. 2 bars have marked ritenuto a tempo. but also one entire page we have in which Czerny indicates mosso, which is a little bit faster. So in the general exercise, I don't think that makes a lot of difference. So I calculated the average, which is 109 instead of 104 prescribed by Czerny. So the player here is a lot slower, and 109 is a pretty steady average. The pianist actually takes that tempo also at the beginning. There's one spot particularly that I want to share with you where the pianist goes to 100. So it goes from 109 back to 100. It's obviously because of the difficulties. Listen to that and also experience the dragging of the tempo, where you really can feel that the intention of the pianist here is not to slow down, but he has to because of the difficulties of this movement. And again, I cannot underline this enough. It's the exercise that we're doing in this video. The tempo is already much slower to begin with. And guys, this is not an amateur pianist. 99% of you watching right now will never ever be even close to what this pianist already achieves here in this, again, too slow tempo. Let's listen. I could share a lot more fragments, but just the end. It's oftentimes worth your time checking the end if the tempo is not correct at the end. When the piece has to come to a closure, oftentimes weird things happen. Here as well, Czerny gives like a kind of appoggiaturas and 16th notes, anticipations of the big chords, but in that tempo, again, already too slow tempo, it's not feasible to do that. So the pianist here searches for a very musical solution, but it's not written in the score. Let's listen. As you have seen or heard, the last 16th note is lengthened from a 16th note even to a quarter note. That's not a small compromise. That's a huge compromise. I'm not saying that this solution sounds particularly unconvincingly. It's very convincingly done. But the necessity to do that comes forth from the fact that the initial tempo is already too fast. There is no way you can end this piece convincingly without doing something weird. It's a compromise to the score. And just a final remark on that first movement. Czerny marks that movement with allegro con spirito, which is not a particularly fast tempo description. If an allegro tempo is already too fast for an accomplished pianist, then we have a huge problem, I think. As an exercise, to really close this first movement, and I know many of you like that, here is a digitally sped up fragment of this first movement when single beat would really be what Czerny had in mind. Here it is. Movement 2 will be a shocker to many. And I know that when we talk about whole beat metronome use, that there are many people that say like, yeah, but in slow movements this will never work because then the slow movements become so incredibly slow that everything falls apart. There is so fragmented the performance that there is no line, there's nothing anymore. While in reality, the slow movements are equally problematic technically compared to the fast movements. And I would say even they have some specialities in the sense that there are aspects in slow movements that makes it even more problematic. And this is one example of that. Let's first listen to a few seconds at the beginning. So the opening tempo, Czerny prescribes 8th note 84, Jones start in 66, which is 20% slower. And you could say like, did the pianist, do we know of that pianist that he wanted to reach the tempo markings prescribed by Czerny? No, I don't. But there is also a reality in terms of technique like in the first movement, and we will see that even more in the fourth movement. There is no possibility, there is no real possibility to go faster. If we would leave out all the metronome marks ever given, then what would be the trigger for these musicians to go even that fast? So the metronome marks today generally are seen as targets, but that's not the case. There is in the 19th century not a single quote of a musician or of a composer that confirms the fact that metronome marks are only targets. We've seen what Czerny writes about tempo indications made by composers, but we've also shared in previous videos quite a lot what Czerny marks at the beginning of his really much discussed etudes, which are way faster than this. You practice the piece until you reach my prescribed tempo. So there is no discussion that when the composer marks a tempo, he really wants you to play in that exact tempo, and that tempo is not for the happy 0.001%. Why would you do that as a composer, to mark a tempo that nobody can play, while saying you have to play it? So this movement contains a lot of what we could call like bel canto ornaments. It's like an imitation of really opera singers, Italian style. We talked about that a lot on this channel. Whenever Beethoven uses that, or Chopin uses that, or Schumann, or Haydn, or Mozart, left hand remains steady in tempo. That's the whole meaning of this exercise. That's a tempo rubato of that time. Left hand remains stable, the right hand has a certain liberty. You don't play 4 notes or 8 notes or 12 notes, you play like 5 notes or 7 or 9 or 13, but you end always gently, similar to the left hand. But the left hand is your choir master, as Chopin would write. So in this case, obviously, those many notes, they influence the tempo that Jones takes at the beginning, which, as we've seen, is already 20% too slow. He will slow down even more. If we calculate the average of this piece, there are only 3 bars, actually 2 bars and 1 note at the end, in which Czerny marks ritardando and more adagio, and we leave out these bars and we calculate the average of the rest, then Jones actually plays this piece not in the marked 84, but his average is, and I told you it would be a shocker, 44 for the 8th notes. Well, that is almost exactly whole beat. And seeing the fact that he starts at the beginning in a faster tempo, there has to be parts where he goes even slower. I just share one of such passages with you. There is one trill here on the 16th note. There is no indication by Czerny whatsoever to do some crazy stuff there, so he obviously just wants you to perform that trill in the tempo that is indicated at the beginning. See and listen what the player does here. The third movement is a scherzo. I will not share too much about this. Honestly, I was a little bit too lazy to see whether the player played all the repeats or not. So we focus just on the opening tempo. There, Jones takes 132 instead of the prescribed 152 by Czerny. That's again much slower than Czerny prescribes. And then we come to the fourth movement. Just give you a small fragment to start with. So Czerny asks for 80, half note, so whole bar equals 80. When I calculated the average tempo here, I didn't include the coda, which is a presto. Czerny doesn't give metronomes there. And on the rest, there are 2 spots where Czerny marks tranquillo, but there are also 2 spots where he marks con fuoco. So I thought that compensates, so that doesn't give any influence on the average, I would say. So Czerny marks 80, Jones plays 53. That's 35% slower. And again, in this case, Czerny marks the piece with allegro con fuoco. Well, that's faster than the allegro con spirito of the first movement, but that's not the fastest tempo description that he could have given for this piece. Well, allegro assai, presto, prestissimo, that's faster to much faster than allegro con fuoco. And already in this case, if you listen to Jones playing, it's not slow. So imagine to speed this up 35%. And listen, I'm not doing this just for fun. These sped up fragments are also important for you to notice and to witness, like, what actually is a single beat experience if it were possible to play. Oftentimes people say that whole beat, our metronome approach, means halving the tempo as we are used to hear them right now. But that would assume that we live in a single beat universe. So that would assume, in other words, that players today just took Metronome Marks if they were interested and just played them in a single beat. But that's not really possible. Sometimes it is, in some cases yes, but in the majority of the cases, and even when it would be possible, players have the tendency to play much slower, 20, 30, 40. Some pieces even are still in whole beat today in mainstream performances. So it's not the case that when you go to whole beat performance that you halve all the performances tempi into, but you have actually the metronome marks into, and that's a huge difference. And so for that reason, a single beat exercise in the sense like taking a performance, speeding it up to single beat, gives you actually an impression what single beat would sound like. And that will be in many cases, I hope at least, enough to realize that even if we were capable of reaching those tempi, those single beat metronome speeds, I don't think that many people today would want to live in that universe. And if you're impressed with that single beat tempo, well, what you're listening to are 10.6 notes per second. Again, the first etude of the Czerny Opus 299, which is a presto, goes in 14.4 notes a second. And granted, that is easier than this, that's just a scale. But page through the Czerny etudes and also the more advanced ones, and you will see passages that go beyond just simple scales in similar speeds. The tempo of Jones here, already impressive, 7 notes a second. So listen, it's not my intention, again, to point fingers to anyone. This is a really nice performance. I'm not against the way that Mr. Jones plays this sonata in. What I want to do in this series and why I'm using these performances is to make you aware of the fact that what Czerny had in mind, and for that sake also what Beethoven had in mind, what Schumann had in mind, what Mendelssohn had in mind, what Brahms had in mind, what Chopin had in mind, what Moscheles had in mind, what Field had in mind, what Ries had in mind, all these composers with their crazy metronome marks, is not something unimaginably fast. It's the other way around. Why is that important? Well, that's up to you to decide. For me personally, it's more than just doing justice to the composer intention. My experience is, as for instance with the Beethoven symphonies that we are about to release in a beautiful box of 10 CDs. I know I advertise this box a lot, but I'm super proud of that. But the experience you have when you take this seriously is that there is a musical universe that opens that is just unimaginable. Like, if you enjoy Beethoven's music right now, and you've never heard these symphonies played in whole beat on this beautiful pianoforte, by the way, in an extraordinary transcription by this Mr. Czerny. It's unmatched, even not by Liszt's transcription. And by the way, Liszt was a student of Czerny, who taught him this art of transcribing. These transcriptions made by Czerny of the Beethoven symphonies are just ridiculously good. They are so symphonic, they are so good that even Alberto and Alberto is the player I play these symphonies with, are searching for something that can just stand next to that. But there is nothing. The Schumann symphonies transcribed by Schumann, the Brahms symphonies transcribed by Brahms, very well done, but it's not on the level on which Czerny just transcribed the symphonies by his beloved master. It's not. It's so symphonic. It's not chamber music anymore. Anyways, when you are diving into that music, when you are blessed to have time to do that, or to take time to do that, we worked 4 years on those recordings, there is a beauty that opens for you, and there is a power, there is so much emotion, there is so much clarity, it's beyond words what happens then. That's also the reason why I want to share that with you, because I want you to experience that. Hopefully already in that CD box with those 9 symphonies. Just check it out, there's a link in the description box. So, I hope you enjoyed this video. There are other tempo reality check videos that I made in the past. You can check them out by clicking on this thumbnail over here. And also, if you have suggestions for a tempo reality check, if you would like me to go over one particular piece, well, there is a link in the description box as well that leads you to our website, and you find a contact page. When you leave me a message there, I promise you to get back to you, not in one day, but over time you will receive an answer, as this piece was suggested to me by David. For now, thanks for watching. We see each other soon again.